Is the Rolex Datejust the ultimate sports watch? Or is it the Equaterra? And what about the integrated sports options? Is the Cartier Santos a contender? Is it even necessary to pay that much money for a really good sports watch? Sports and integrated watches are likely the most popular category of watches out there. They are probably more popular than desk divers, so people want to know that they're getting a good watch. I've got some clear options for you, plus a guide to what you should consider looking for when choosing a great sports watch. For those of you that know me, this is probably not going to come as a surprise. I've been working on a model, a framework of sorts to better explain how I evaluate a watch. Something that could aid people in understanding where I'm coming from so that they can make up their own minds. The model is still a work in progress, but basically to me, a good watch comes down to the following criteria. Design, creativity, originality. I mean, that's technically 3 words, but it's essentially an evaluation of a mix of aesthetic appeal, which is subjective, how original it is, and the creative effort that seems to have gone into the watch as a whole. Second, it's manufacturing of the body. This is down to how well, from a manufacturing perspective, everything is put together. It's the tolerances, the polish, the materials, the click of a bezel if it's a diver, all those kind of things. Third is the manufacturing of the movement. This, again, is the core functionality of the movement. How solid is it? How precise is it? All that kind of stuff. Fourth, you've got craft. Craft is for me the piece where manufacturing starts to transition from pure machined proficiency to some variant of handmaidedness. Now, the line between manufacturing and craft is a hazy one. Rolex polishes parts of the cases manually, and they also hand set dials. They do a lot of things by hand, but for me, that does not necessarily make the watches handmade. Very few, if any, watches are fully handmade. But at some point you go from things that are manufacturing and fully manufactured to manufacturing with a person's hand involved versus handmade as the last category, which is almost artisanal work. Craft for me is that end of the scale. This is the spot where you're mainly dependent on the person doing the work, but also where it can make a difference who that person was that did it. That to me is craft, and more often than not, it costs big time, and often it's even marketed as a standalone quality of the watch. The last thing is identity, essentially branding. I do include this as an evaluation factor. As you go up in price, identity has a cost associated with it, and not all people feel that cost is justified because it doesn't in any objective way make the watch better. But the fact is, a lot of the emotional resonance with the product a buyer has is connected to the brand identity. Those are the factors: design, manufacturing of the body, manufacturing of the movement, craft, identity. Which brings me to a good sub $500 sports watch. My general rule of thumb when it comes to sub $500 is that manufacturing of the body is going to be pretty decent. If there's one place where the distance from a high-end mass-produced watch to a cheap mass-produced watch is the smallest, it's going to be on the manufacturing. A well-polished case here is not going to look a whole lot different than a well-polished case on Omega. There will be differences. Clasps can be really good, but tolerances are often a little bit too tight or a little bit too loose. They're never going to fail, but they don't quite hit that sweet spot of tight, but still unbelievably easy to open, which is something you definitely know from a Rolex bracelet. Clasps might also be a little bit long because they need more space for, an excellently functioning, but engineering-wise, basic, easy adjust mechanism. Finishing is going to be good, but not complex. The movement is going to be extremely basic. It's going to have medium to low power reserve. It's going to have limited guarantees on accuracy. It's going to have limits on the robustness in terms of anti-magnetism, shock absorption, things like that. Identity, in fairness, is not non-existent, and for the lovers of this price point, there can be an emotional response. But marketing and brand building is not something these brands have spent a lot of money on because they don't have that money. Craft is going to be more or less non-existent. You can't get a $500 watch where the dial is hand guillocheed or movement is hand engraved. What you can get is design. There's a risk of a lot of watches at this price point being derivative, but the good watches are watches where someone has tried to come up with their own version of a type of watch. Here are 3 options that embody these characteristics. From a brand I don't talk a lot about, but I do have some experience with, Notice. The movement is an entry-level Seiko NH movement with, plus 10, minus 10 seconds of accuracy. It's got 41 hours of power reserve. This watch has that decent but not stellar manufacturing I was talking about. It's 12.5 millimeters thick. It's got a decent lug-to-lug of 47 millimeters, and it's overall 38 millimeters in diameter. You've got yourself a stepped sunray dial with a lot of lume. This is more of a brushed affair when it comes to finishing, but it's well put together. The stepped dial for me is what sets it apart from a sea of generic dials in this space. If you want something with a bit more creativity, the Brew Metric has a lot going for it. There's a mecha quartz movement inside. The bracelet for the price is phenomenal. The clasp is what I would call par for the course. Just like the Nodus, the movement is basic, the manufacturing is pretty decent. Identity is a little bit stronger simply because of the design language, and it's creatively a watch that sets itself a whole lot more apart. We've got a mall not far from my house. It's got a supermarket, it's got a bakery, it's got a fitness center, a dollar store, it's got a McDonald's, and it's got an iPhone repair shop. It also has a jewelry store, and in the 10 years I've lived here, I've never gone inside. Except the other day I did, because they had the Citizen Zenshin. Inside, you've got a mechanical movement, which isn't exactly a selling point at this price, but it's still a decent movement for the price. The dials are good looking. The watch wears well. And yes, the bracelet is exactly what you would expect with push pins and all. But this watch is a hit for a reason. What happens above $500? Movements take a step up. They're still primarily just good movements, but they're typically regulated better. They're often that bit better in terms of robustness, and at the higher end, a manufacturer might throw in a display case back and a custom rotor. Seiko will make a model every now and again where a little bit of the case has received the Zaratsu treatment. So you get a move along the scale of pure manufacturing to something towards, but not quite, craft. Pure craft is still very rare in this space, but manufacturing that has a craft-like component does rear its head every now and again. As for the body of the watch, it might not always be readily apparent what gets better, but there are some nuanced improvements that you start to see. It's a decent, easy adjust mechanism. It's more common to see screwed links instead of push pins. Crowns might both be smaller or they might be engraved. Identity takes a step up as well, potentially, but a lot of the brands here are mainly competing on value over emotion. The selling point is often leaning heavily into this value story. From a creativity perspective, you're not necessarily getting much more, but typically you'll see brands invest in certain areas from a manufacturing perspective that give the watch more of a refined look. Of the good options, Seiko Presage SPP 465 and similar models. The bracelets from Seiko at this price point continue to be among the worst out there. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're subpar on the manufacturing piece of those bracelets. But their dials typically stand out, and that's both a plus in terms of manufacturing and in terms of creativity. The Fairer Exmoor is also a watch that I think embodies the characteristics of a good sub $1,500 watch. It's got your classic Sellita SW movement. I think it's a 2-to-1 in this case. The pointer date is infinitely more interesting and aesthetically pleasing than most 3 o'clock window dates out there. You get a really decent easy adjust mechanism. The dial is textured, and combined with the case, it leans more towards a field watch kind of vibe over a sports watch, but it will do both. You're still not getting mountains of power reserve or stellar finishing, but overall it's a really decent option. This is a fan favorite, and a lot of you have mentioned this watch in the comments. It's the Tissot Gentleman. It's a good example of what Tissot do well. It's not a great movement, but a really well-spec'd movement with 80 hours of power reserve and a -2 to +8 second accuracy. This particular variant has the silicone hairspring, so it has better than average anti-magnetic properties as well. The case is simple and elegant. It has a few things aesthetically in common with a non-fluted Datejust, right down to the polished center links on the bracelet, the polished bezel, and a simple sunray dial with baton hands. It's got wedged markers and several dial options, including those ever popular sunray options. By the way, if you've made it this far and you feel like the video warrants it, give it a like. And if you're new to the channel, click that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Thanks a ton. It is possible between $1,500 to $5,000 to get a watch that from a manufacturing perspective is 98 to 99% of the best you can get out there. The finishing and tolerances on a Patek Nautilus or a Rolex will be better than a Tudor, but it's really a question of devil is in the details. Above this point, diminishing returns really start to kick in on that base manufacturing. But the slider does start to move. Whether it's Zaratsu polishing or hand setting of dials, there's more manual work involved with these watches without it turning into pure play craft. But it's not just pure machining either. It's not that any watches have zero hands touching it, but it's just more. My point is, the machines available to these brands in this price range are basically the same machines as those in use at much more expensive brands. When it comes to the movement, this is more or less also the case. For under $5,000, you will get a fully META certified movement. Now, if you watch my channel, you know how I feel about the importance of METAS, but here I'm just pointing out that from a pure specification perspective, there's pretty much nothing above this price point that manufacturing-wise on the movement gets better. Accuracy, anti-magnetism, shock resistance, power reserve, all of it. Above $1,500, whether it's Dean or Kosk or METAS, a lot of manufacturers are going to be promising high degrees of accuracy and excellent specs. I would go so far as to say that if they're not promising it, that's really a bit of a detractor. Then we've got craft. Design, identity, creativity. Craft does start to rear its head here. It's not common by any stretch of the imagination, but it is here. Atelier Wen hand guilloches the dial on the Perception. Fears hand grain the case of the Brunswick, and Ordain do enameling of dials entirely by hand. Other brands hand polish certain elements of a case. The thing is, this adds a lot of cost that you need to be mindful of because it can make comparing watches at a similar price point really, really difficult. A hand-turned guilloche dial adds significant cost overall to a watch. Hand polishing a case takes a case that might on its own cost $40 or $50 or $60 to produce up to a whole lot more just because the hand finishing, if it's a complex case with multiple facets and angles, makes it really, really expensive. That small nuance really adds cost. You'll pay more for these kind of details, and it's entirely justified from a production cost perspective. Now, whether you personally feel that way is a different story. When it comes to creativity, there is a lot of design in this space, but because this is often the mass market space, I feel there is a tendency for more products to kind of look like each other. Considering the size of this market, the tendency to converge in the middle is a little bit greater. Identity also in the space begins to add cost. Whether it's Nomos or Longines or Tudor or entry-level tags, you're starting to pay for the identity building now to a much greater extent than you were before. The pinnacle of manufacturing in this point is likely Tudor for me. In more and more models, you get the META certification, you get a stellar level of finishing for the price, you get one of the best 5-link bracelets and clasps in the business, you get an overall nice looking watch, which albeit creatively or design-wise is incredibly middle of the road. Slightly lower down, you've got the Longines Spirit. It's not METAS, now it's Kosk. You still get a really good bracelet. The clasp is not quite on Tudor's level, but from a manufacturing perspective, you have a really good watch. Slightly less complex style, but still great. For what you lose in terms of manufacturing quality, you gain in terms of lower price. Neither of these watches have anything I would call craft, which brings me to a watch I've already mentioned, which is the Perception from Atelier Wen. This is a good reflection of how good a Chinese watch can be. Design is what sets it apart. The finishing from a manufacturing perspective is bar a few tiny details on par with a Tudor. Specifically, the clasp is good, but just not quite as good in my opinion. The movement is also a compromise. At plus minus 10 seconds and only around 40 hours of power reserve, you're getting a little bit less than the Swiss brands, but craft is what you're getting in spades because that hand-turned guilloche is setting you back only $3,000. So it's your choice. Tudor with pretty much body and movement manufacturing nailed to 98% of perfection with a very middle of the road design and a bit of a premium for the name. Then Longines with some compromises here and there at a lower price, but also middle of the road. Or you go for something out of left field where you lose those movement specs. You get close, but not on par with Tudor or Longines in terms of manufacturing, but you get that little bit of craft and a little bit of design, which make it for a vastly more compelling choice if those things are important to you. Above $5,000, you are more or less not going to see much more than marginal gains in terms of that base manufacturing quality of the body of the watch. The same goes for the movement. Rolex has their superlative chronometer. Omega has METAS. It's important to point out though that although you're not getting a lot more here, it does not imply that all brands are equally good. Zenith still has subpar bracelets. Omega clasps sometimes do not have the cutting edge quick adjust mechanisms on all models. Grand Seiko have indicated that their bracelets will get a lift eventually, but it hasn't happened yet. From a manufacturing perspective, I think 3 brands consistently stand out. It's Rolex, it's Omega, and if you exclude the bracelets, it's Grand Seiko. Grand Seiko, I'd even go so far, are the best when ignoring the bracelets. They've got a precision in their polish. They've got a sharpness of plots, of markers and hands, which is rarely, if ever, surpassed by comparably priced Swiss brands. You might not like the aesthetic, but manufacturing-wise on the core body, Grand Seiko are the best you can get out there. Hopefully it goes without saying that the price of identity in this price range is high. Rolex is the winner or loser depending on how you look at it. The difference in quality between a Equiterra and a Datejust or Oyster Perpetual is not huge. It's there, but the Rolexes are more or less consistently much more expensive. And that's because the identity of Rolex for a majority of people, maybe not you, is just stronger. Then there's craft. Craft is still not common here. These are brands that have primarily been good at the manufacturing and identity piece. Rolex doesn't hand-turn Guilloche anything at this price point. To my knowledge, neither does Omega. But there are a couple of exceptions. Jaeger-LeCoultre with their newest Reverso at $8,900. I've been rough on JLC for their pricing, but this watch is a relatively speaking interesting proposition. The leather Saffiano strap is the best in the business, and there's a suppleness and a quality to this like you just can't imagine. The movement is shaped to a case. Now, if those of you that remember the Cubitus, that was not a movement that was shaped to the case. Parts of the movement are hand finished, which you'll of course never see because there's no display case back, but they did it. The case itself is more complex to put together than you would think, and without getting into the weeds of how it's put together, there are multiple elements that require more than simple CNC machining and machine polishing. There's a craft in this watch that you're paying for. We can have a long discussion about whether or not the Reverso is really a sports watch, but it's a good example of how complicated the discussion about quality and pricing can get. If the Reverso isn't sporty enough for you and the craft piece isn't quite compelling enough, I do believe the three best options are the Equiterra, the Oyster Perpetual, or the Datejust, and a white birch Grand Seiko. At $6,000 or so, the Equiterra has the best movement in the business. Between $6,000 and $10,000 for the Datejust, it's got the best bracelet, it's got the most iconic bezel, although that might be over $10,000 for that model. And overall, I would call it, the on-average winner and the biggest premium for identity. Just below $10,000, you get the SLGH 005. It's got an excellent movement, but not typically rated robustness-wise on the level of the two Swiss models. It's got a subpar bracelet, but it's got a bar-none dial and casecraft that is the best of the three. Grand Seikos are subtle in their design language, but the dials are phenomenal and almost craft-like in their execution, and the manufacturing of those watches are just that bit sharper and cleaner compared to the Swiss options. That's my opinion, at least. A curious thing happens as you go from $10,000 and up and move towards 25 or more. When it comes to movements, they actually in some ways get worse than the lower end manufactured models. Power reserve potentially declines. You've got something like Vacheron Overseas that comes in at around $25,000 and it has 10 hours less than a Rolex Datejust. It's also less accurate. The Geneva seal, which the Overseas, as far as I remember, has a lot of different criteria, but relatively few of them are about hardcore specs like magnetism and accuracy. The accuracy is, and I'll confirm that in a box somewhere, is a maximum deviation of something like 1 minute in a 7-day period. That's significantly less accurate than COSC or METAS. The Geneva seal, however, has a whole lot more criteria that pertain to craft. Finishing of all sorts of things, including thickness of bridges and hand beveling and Geneva striping. They even prescribe, I think, how a sink for a jewel has to be recessed and at what angle, and probably also which tool has to be used. These are all much more craft and aesthetics focused criteria than the more objective criteria that apply to mass-produced movements and cases. The other thing that happens is that sports watches tend to be more of the integrated bracelet variety. So you've got your Nautilus and your Royal Oak and your Cubitus and your Streamliner and your Overseas and your Odysseus. They're just more common to be integrated. If you were in any doubt, here in this space, you're paying for identity. A Cubitus costs $40,000. A steel Overseas costs around $25,000. Now, is there an objective reason for there to be such a massive price difference? No, not even close. I've handled enough Overseas and Nautilus models to know that there's not a $15,000 manufacturing or craft difference in those two watches. If you feel there's a difference, let me know in the comments. For me, I don't have the eye for that level of differentiation, at least not $15,000 worth. Maybe Patek are a bit better, but you'll likely still have a hard time convincing me that it's worth $15,000 more, excluding the identity component. What you're paying for, other than identity, and to be transparent, the markup for identity here is huge. You're usually paying for craft. From a manufacturing perspective, you're not getting a whole lot more. An example of this, which I've used before and I really like, is the Lange Odysseus. The Odysseus has the exact same quick adjustment bracelet system that you'll find on a Glashütte CQ and an IWC Pilot Mark 20. The subcontractor is a company called Brogioli that deliver identical products to Lange & Söhne, IWC, and Glashütte. You'll also find Girard-Perregaux models that have a bracelet that is made at the exact same factory that makes cases for Formex. The tolerances might not be identical, but it's the same factory. You are getting a movement that will have hand-polished and beveled bridges. Every sink is polished and hand-drilled on many models. A dial would often, but not always, be hand-turned guilloche'd. There's a massive level of intricacy to both cases, dials, bracelets, and movements that take time and effort, and it's often manual effort. It's not all handmade, for sure. Very rarely, if ever, is that the case. A lot is still manufacturing in the sense that a machine is doing some of the work. But even there, you're likely to see elements that are more difficult or time-consuming to do. So yes, a piece of the bracelet may be machined, as it were, but the bracelet complexity on something like a Royal Oak is just higher than that goes into an oyster bracelet. It's not orders of magnitude more complex, but it is more complex. And generally, you can say that brands at this point usually aren't, or shouldn't, be considering whether additional complexity eats into their margins. If it looks good and differentiates their product, they should do it. An overseas bracelet is likely that bit more complex manufacturing-wise than an oyster or an omega bracelet. Plus, it's more likely that elements of it are going to have some level of hand finishing applied to it. For me, where brands in the 5,000, 10,000 space have a tendency to converge on similar designs, at this level, they diverge. The higher up you go, the more it's expected for a brand to have a really distinctive signature design. The distance in similarity from an Aquaterra to an Oyster Perpetual, to me at least, is much smaller than the distance in similarity from a Nautilus to a Royal Oak, despite the literal fact that the latter two were designed by the same guy. I've got three options that embody three different levels of product in this space. At the, let's call it entry high level, I have the Bulgari Octo Finissimo, a watch that I owned for 5 years until I sold it this year, actually. I didn't wear it enough anymore, but at $13,500, you are getting a lot of watch for the money. You're not getting as much craft as some of the higher end offerings. The movement is beautiful, but more rugged or simply put together compared to the rest, but it is thin, which manufacturing-wise is pretty impressive. The thing that sets this watch apart is the thinness and the exceptional wearing experience. This thing just wraps around your wrist. The links are super narrow, so you can get a perfect fit. And you only do it once though, and you need a pro to do it. This is not a screw link do-it-yourself kind of solution. Moving up to around $25,000, I think you get some of the best, inverted commas, value you can get up there. This watch doesn't hold its value in the way that Patek or AP typically do. This watch might even drop in price eventually, but it's possible to get, and it's the overseas. Right beside it, if you could get it at retail, is the Royal Oak. They are classics for a reason. For me, AP typically has the edge when it comes to dials, but both are iconic. Finally, Parmigiani Tonda PF Micro Rotor. It'll set you back about $25,000 depending on the model. Of all the watches I've suggested, this is the one that has the simplest of designs, and that's the key strength of this watch. At this level, the brands have this need to make something that is quickly identifiable for this or that watch. It's the Alpine Eagle, it's the Streamliner, it's the Nautilus. You know it immediately, and I suppose you do too with the Parmigiani, but for me, because it's one of the plainest, simplest, and most importantly, most subtle of high-end watches. This is your high-end black dial Aquaterra until you get close. The dial, the bezel, the hands, the bracelet, everything just has an understated premiumness that just really speaks to me. Manufacturing-wise, craft-wise, very little separates these brands. I'm not skilled enough to look at a dial at this level and see if one hand-turned dial is better executed than some other hand-turned dial. But these three watches all speak to me as really good options. So, I listed some options of different watches at different price points and explained my reasoning. The goal isn't really to get you to choose any of these watches or even like them. You like what you like, and that's the way it should be. But all of these watches function as reference points for me as to what I feel you can reasonably expect at a given price point. Every now and again, I'll swap out those reference points with new reference points, but they are useful because they are examples of watches I use to compare other watches to. So I've got that Longines Conquest in the back of my mind when I'm holding a Nomus Club Sport. What's better? What's worse? What am I getting? What am I not? And I use my model. because I overcomplicate things sometimes, but it's a useful model for me. Manufacturing, design, craft, identity. It might be useful to you. Now it's time for me to learn from you. What are the things you look for as a good evaluation criteria for a watch? Your version of manufacturing, craft, identity, design. What do you weigh? Share in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.